It began quietly, so quietly that I almost dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of my half-asleep mind. I remember the first night vividly, because the silence of it was louder than anything I'd ever known. The kind of silence that presses into your ears, where even the hum of the refrigerator seems to fade out, leaving only the pounding of your own heart as proof that you're still alive. The phone rang. It wasn't a polite chime or a cheerful tone. It was sharp, metallic, the kind of sound that cuts through darkness like a blade. My phone was an old landline, the kind that still sat on the small wooden table in my hallway. The sound echoed strangely against the walls, stretching itself thin as though the house itself was holding its breath. I glanced at the clock by my bed. 12:03 a.m. I remember hesitating, staring at the shadows along my bedroom wall. The corners of the room felt heavier at that hour, darker than they ever seemed during the day. The ringing continued, steady, deliberate, each shrill note pulling me out of the warmth of the blankets until my feet touched the cold floorboards. The hallway was colder. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic, like wet coins left out in the rain. The light bulb overhead flickered as I walked beneath it, giving off a pale, sickly glow that seemed too weak to truly light the space. I picked up the receiver. There was no voice, just silence. Not the static of a bad line, not the muffled breathing of some prank caller. Just pure, heavy silence, like someone was on the other end listening. Waiting. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, straining, trying to convince myself that maybe I'd hear something. A whisper, the faint rustle of movement, anything at all. But there was nothing, and then the line went dead. I stood there for a moment longer, the receiver pressed against my ear, listening to the emptiness that replaced the call. My fingers trembled slightly as I hung it back on the cradle. A part of me wanted to laugh, to chalk it up to some wrong number or technical glitch. But the silence in the house after I hung up was worse. It clung to me, pressing down on my chest, filling my lungs with an invisible weight. I returned to bed that night, pulling the blanket up over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me flinch. Every shadow in the corners seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The calls continued. Not every night, but often enough that I began to dread the clock striking midnight. Sometimes it was 12:01, sometimes 12:07, but always after midnight. Always when the house was still, and the air outside seemed heavier than usual. The phone would ring. I would answer, and there would be nothing. No voice. No sound. Just the unmistakable weight of someone there. Someone listening. I began to notice small things. The air around the phone always seemed colder, as though the receiver itself was leaching warmth from the room. A faint, acrid scent, like burnt dust or old wires, would linger in the hallway after each call. Sometimes, when I pressed the receiver against my ear, I swore I could feel the faintest vibration, as though a breath I couldn't hear was brushing against the line. The silence became unbearable. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It was something alive, something heavy, pushing into me through the phone, crawling into my mind. I started to fear answering, but ignoring it was worse. If I didn't pick up, the phone would ring and ring and ring, until it seemed the sound had seeped into my bones. I thought about unplugging it once. My hand hovered over the cord, ready to pull it free from the wall, but I stopped. There was a part of me that was terrified of what might happen if I cut the connection. As though by doing so, I would be breaking some fragile boundary, inviting whatever was on the other end to step closer. So I kept answering, and it kept listening. Over time, my nights became a blur of tension and sleeplessness. The phone had become an anchor in the darkness, a reminder that I wasn't alone, even when I desperately wanted to be. I began to dread the silence more than any scream. At least a scream is human. At least a scream can be explained. But silence, deliberate, crushing silence, felt like a predator crouching in the dark. I noticed changes in myself too. My reflection in the mirror looked hollow, with dark rings beneath my eyes, my skin pale as though I hadn't seen the sun in months. I'd catch myself staring at the phone in the hallway during the day, waiting, expecting it to ring. Sometimes I thought I heard it, phantom echoes of that sharp tone. But when I went to check, the house was empty, the phone still. Then the silence started following me. I'd be at the grocery store, the hum of fluorescent lights and chatter of strangers surrounding me, and suddenly it would all feel muted. The world around me would dim, sounds slipping away, until all that remained was that same suffocating stillness. I'd freeze in the aisle, staring at the boxes and cans as though they were part of a set, and I was alone in something else entirely. It always happened after the calls, as though the silence was bleeding out of the phone, spreading into my life. One night, I woke to the phone already in my hand. I don't remember getting up, don't remember walking into the hallway. I was just standing there, receiver pressed against my ear, the icy weight of it cutting into my skin. And the silence, it was different. Closer. This time I could hear it. Not words, not breathing, but the silence had a texture. A faint scratching, as if nails were grazing against wood, just barely audible beneath the surface. I froze, my heart hammering, sweat cold on my forehead. The scratching grew sharper, more insistent, until it almost drowned out my own pulse. And then it stopped. The line went dead. But the scratching didn't. It was in the walls. At first faint, as though something was crawling inside the house itself. Then louder, spreading from the hallway into the living room, into the bedroom. The sound of something burrowing, something that had been waiting. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the darkened hallway, the phone slipping from my fingers, clattering against the floor. The scratching grew frantic, desperate, and I swore I saw the shadows shift, swelling against the walls as though they weren't shadows at all, but holes, doorways, leading somewhere I was never meant to see. And in the silence between each scratch, I knew. It was listening, not just through the phone anymore. It was in the house. It was with me. The next night, the phone rang at 12 o'clock sharp. I didn't answer, but I heard it anyway. That silence, that weight, pressing against my ears, filling the room, as though the call had no need for wires or lines anymore. The air turned cold, and from beneath the bed, from behind the walls, from the hollow spaces of the house itself, the scratching began again. And it hasn't stopped. Not once. I think the midnight caller is still here. Still waiting. Still listening. It started with a sound I thought I'd long since forgotten. The phone. Not the soft chime of a modern smartphone. Not the gentle buzz of a notification. This was sharper, colder. A ring that didn't belong to my time anymore. The kind of metallic tone from the older landline phones. Each note slicing through the silence like a blade. I was in my living room when it happened. The television was off, the clock on the wall ticking at its usual steady pace, the faint hum of the refrigerator bleeding through the thin walls. Everything was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. And then came that sound. It wasn't possible. I hadn't owned a landline in years. The last one had been disconnected when I moved here, and I never bothered to have another installed. The phone itself was long gone, tucked away, broken, or thrown out. But the sound was unmistakable. The exact cadence, the exact metallic screech of it vibrating in the air, as though it were still sitting on a side table in the hallway. The ring echoed once. Then again. I stood there, frozen, half expecting it to be some strange noise from outside. Maybe a neighbor's old phone, though none of them ever had visitors. But no, the sound wasn't muffled, wasn't distant. It was sharp and right there in the room with me, as if the phone itself had been placed just a few feet away. The air felt different when it rang, colder, as though the warmth of the room had been sucked into the sound itself. My skin prickled, gooseflesh rising across my arms. The light above me seemed to dim, not flicker, but fade like something was swallowing it. And then came the third ring. I remember slowly turning my head, even though I already knew where it was coming from. The sound was pulling me, dragging me toward the corner near the window where there was nothing, just an empty table with a lamp. No phone, no cord, no outlet, but the sound pulsed from there anyway, echoing as if it had always belonged. I can't explain why I moved closer. Curiosity, maybe, or something less natural, like I wasn't the one deciding anymore. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I approached. The air smelled strange now, faintly of dust, old paper, something stale and forgotten. It reminded me of the inside of an abandoned house, or the hollow smell of a storage unit left locked for decades. The fourth ring came when I was only a step away. Louder, as if whatever was ringing knew I was near. That's when I saw it. Not in the way you see something solid, something placed in front of you. It was more like the memory of an object had forced its way into the present. For the briefest moment, I could almost make out the outline of a phone. Black, heavy, the kind with a curled cord and a rotary dial. It wasn't fully there, not entirely, but just enough for my eyes to register. Just enough for my brain to scream that it shouldn't be possible. The fifth ring vibrated against my skull. And then, without touching it, without even daring to reach out, I heard the click. The sound of someone, or something, on the other end picking up. The silence that followed was the worst part. It wasn't empty silence. It was heavy, dense, pressing into my ears like the phone line stretched not across distance, but across time. My throat tightened. The only sound I could hear now was the faint static, low and distant, like a storm trapped far away on some dead frequency. I waited, or maybe I was made to wait. My breath slowed, my heart beat a hammer against my ribs. I wanted to move, to walk away, but it felt like my feet had sunk into the floor itself. And then came the breathing. Faint, measured, not quite human, too steady, too exact, like the sound of air moving through something hollow. It filled my ears, even though the phone wasn't pressed against me. It was all around me, seeping into the room itself, as if the walls were exhaling. The air smelled different again. Metallic this time, like rust, like iron. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to something that wasn't supposed to exist. Seconds stretched into something longer. The breathing never changed. No words, no whisper, just that steady exhale, like a machine pretending to be alive. And then the click again. The line went dead, the ringing stopped, and the air seemed to rush back into place. The room brightened. The smell faded. Everything returned to what it had been just minutes before. Except for me. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the house carried weight. The ticking clock became unbearable, the creaks of the old wood beneath me sharper. Every time the refrigerator turned on, I jumped. And always, in the back of my mind, I waited for that ring. It didn't come back the next night, or the one after that, but by the third, I had almost convinced myself it had been a trick of my imagination. Stress, exhaustion, maybe even a dream I'd confused with reality. That was when my cell phone rang. The sound jolted me upright, though this time it wasn't the same metallic screech. It was my usual ringtone, the one I had heard 100 times before. But when I looked at the screen, my blood turned to ice. The number flashing across the display was one I hadn't seen in years. It was my old landline, the one that had been disconnected, the one that shouldn't exist anymore, the one that had rung in my living room 3 nights ago. The digits glowed on the screen like they had been carved there, impossible to ignore. My hands shook as I held the phone. I didn't answer. It rang 5 times before stopping, each one louder in my head than the last, even though the volume never changed. When it ended, I sat in silence, clutching the phone, staring at the blank screen as though it would light up again at any second. But it didn't. Not that night. The next morning, I checked the call log. The number was gone. Not even a trace of a missed call. Like it had never happened. But I know it did. I heard it. I saw it. And sometimes when the house is too quiet, when the air feels too still, I swear I can hear the faintest echo of that ring somewhere deep in the walls. Not loud enough to draw me in. Not yet. Just waiting. Waiting for the moment I can't ignore it anymore. Waiting for me to finally pick up. It started with the phone. Not an old rotary one. Not some antique landline hidden in the corner of a dusty house. No, it was my phone. The same phone I used to scroll aimlessly before bed. The one I checked too many times a day. The one that buzzed on the nightstand while I tried to sleep. There was nothing special about it. Just a phone. But somehow, it became the bridge to something I can't explain, something that followed me long after the calls began. The first time, it happened late at night. The kind of night when the air feels heavier than usual, where the silence is almost too complete. I was lying in bed, staring at the faint glow of the screen. That bluish light has a way of bleaching out everything else in the room, turning familiar furniture into shadowy shapes. My apartment was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator bleeding faintly through the walls. Then, without warning, the phone vibrated. No number on the screen. Not unknown, not blocked, not even a string of digits. Just blank space, as though the call itself came from nowhere. Against my better judgment, I answered. What came through wasn't silence, not at first. There was a faint hiss, like air escaping from a crack in a pipe. Then layered beneath it came whispers. Not words I could understand, not even sounds that belonged to a language I recognized. They were hushed, uneven, like dozens of voices trying to speak over one another, but muffled, distorted by distance. And yet, it felt impossibly close, like someone leaning too near, speaking straight into my ear while I pressed the phone to my head. It lasted less than a minute before the call cut off. I stared at the blank screen, heart thudding hard enough to feel in my chest, convincing myself it had been a glitch, some electronic hiccup. But I couldn't shake the sensation of breath against my skin, of a voice curling into the quiet spaces of my room. I tried to forget it. For a few days, life went on as usual. Work, home, empty meals eaten with the TV buzzing in the background. But at night, I couldn't shake the memory. The silence of the apartment seemed heavier, expectant, as though waiting for the phone to come alive again. And it did. The second time, I let it ring longer before answering. The sound seemed to echo through the room, not like a normal ringtone, but stretched, metallic, unnatural. When I finally pressed the phone to my ear, I heard the same thing, the hiss, the whispers. But this time, I swore I caught something clearer. A word. Just a single one, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. My name. Not spoken in a normal voice. It was dragged out, fragmented, broken by the distortion of static, like someone repeating a sound they didn't understand, forcing the syllables through a throat that didn't quite belong to them. My body went rigid. The whispers kept crawling through the line, growing sharper in rhythm, though never louder, never quite reaching clarity. I pulled the phone away, but the sound didn't stop. For a moment, I swore I could still hear it even without the device pressed against me, like it had bled through, filling the room itself. When the call ended, the silence after was unbearable. The faint hum of electricity in the walls seemed louder, almost vibrating. My skin prickled, every shadow stretched deeper than before, and I couldn't help but look toward the corners of the room as if something might be standing there waiting. From then on, the calls came more often, always at night, always when the apartment was drenched in stillness, when my guard was at its lowest. Sometimes it was just static, sometimes the rush of whispers. Other times that horrible attempt at a word, my name, over and over again, as though learning it piece by piece. I tried to record it once. I left a voice memo running before answering. But when I played it back, there was nothing. Just dead air, an empty track that stretched into silence. That's when I realized it wasn't the phone at all. It was me, because no one else could hear it. I tested it once. My brother came over to help fix a leak under the sink. I left my phone on the counter. When the blank call appeared, I forced myself to act casual and answered, setting it on speaker. His face stayed blank, confused. He heard nothing, just silence. Meanwhile, my skin crawled as the whispers slipped through, louder than ever, almost frantic, almost urgent. I turned the call off before he could notice how pale I'd gone. After that, I stopped trying to involve anyone else. It was mine to carry, whatever it was. The whispers began to change over time. They weren't always fragmented, weren't always wordless. Sometimes they fell into rhythm, a strange cadence like chanting. Not a prayer I knew, not in any language I could trace, but it had weight. I could feel it pressing against my skull, like being underwater, while something moved around me, circling. And then one night, they stopped being confined to the phone. I had just ended a call, if you could call it that, and tossed the phone onto the nightstand. My ears were ringing, head buzzing from the whispers. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. Not from the device. From the corner of the room. The same cadence. The same breathless whispering. Crawling out of the dark where no one stood. I didn't move. My chest felt locked in place, lungs refusing to pull in air. The sound swirled, circling me like a predator testing the edges of its cage. When I finally forced myself to look, nothing was there. Just shadows and the faint outlines of furniture. But the whispers grew louder. Since then, they followed me everywhere. Not constant, not enough for others to notice, but always there, slipping in during quiet moments. A hiss behind the hum of traffic, a soft murmur between words on the television. In the shower, where water drowns out everything else, I can still hear the cadence threading through the spray. At night, it's the worst. The silence becomes their canvas. I don't know what they want. I don't know why they chose me, why I'm the only one who hears. But I've stopped answering the calls. It doesn't matter. The line has already been crossed. Sometimes, I wonder if I should destroy the phone, smash it until there's nothing left but shards and circuitry. But deep down, I know it wouldn't matter. The phone was only ever a doorway. The voices were waiting long before. And now they've stepped through. Even as I write this, I can hear them. Not through the device. Not through walls. But right here, pressed close, just beyond the veil of my skin. Their whispers crawl inside my ears, slipping beneath thought itself, reshaping the silence into something that belongs to them. The phone sits on the table, blank, quiet, harmless looking. But every so often it lights up on its own. No number. No words. Just that empty space. Waiting. And though I tell myself I won't answer again, I know eventually I will. Because the whispers are patient. And when I finally give in, when I press the phone to my ear one last time, I don't think I'll hear them from a distance anymore. I think they'll already be here. It always began at the same time, 3 in the morning, the hour when the world felt thinner, stretched tight like a sheet about to tear. I used to sleep soundly, tucked away in the comfort of my small apartment. The kind of sleep where the dark felt safe, where the silence was only silence. But that changed the night my phone began to ring, exactly at 3 a.m. The calls were never long, never filled with words, but they never failed to leave me trembling beneath the blankets, listening to my own pulse echo in my ears. The first time it happened, I assumed it was a mistake, some drunk dialing the wrong number, or a glitch in the network. My phone lit up beside the bed, vibrating across the wooden nightstand, the screen glowing against the pitch of the room. Half awake, I reached for it, squinting through the blur of sleep. The number was unknown, just a string of digits that didn't look real. Not blocked, not private, but wrong. When I answered, there was nothing. No words. No static. Just an absence. But it wasn't the kind of silence you get when no one's there. It was heavy, pressing, like someone was holding their breath close to the speaker. I remember lying there with the phone against my ear, every hair on my arm standing on end, straining to hear something, anything. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the call ended. I put the phone back down and told myself it was nothing. I tried to sleep again, and maybe I would have believed it was a one-time mistake if it hadn't happened again the next night. At the same time, the same silent, suffocating weight on the other end. After the third night, I stopped pretending it was nothing. My apartment was never truly dark. The streetlights outside bled a pale orange glow through the blinds, casting uneven stripes across the walls and floor. Dust particles drifted in that light, almost invisible until they passed through the orange beams, catching like tiny stars in the still air. The phone always waited on the nightstand, screen black, until the minute hand struck 3. I started watching for it, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stop myself. Every night, I lay awake, eyes flicking to the glowing digits of the alarm clock. 2:58, 2:59. Then, without fail, the phone lit up. I never let it ring more than twice. The sound of it cut too deep into the stillness, too sharp against the fragile quiet of the hour. I would answer, hold my breath, and wait. And always there was nothing. Yet that nothing began to feel alive. I could almost hear something beneath it, like the faint creak of old floorboards, or the low hum of air being drawn into lungs that weren't mine. One night, I thought I heard a whisper. Not words, just a shift in the silence. The sound of lips parting, of breath brushing across the receiver. It made my stomach twist. My hand trembled so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. But no matter how long I held it there, no matter how hard I strained, nothing else came. When the call ended, I realized my own reflection was staring back at me from the black surface of the screen. My face looked pale, stretched, and unfamiliar, like something was watching me through it. Sleep became impossible. I tried everything, earplugs, turning the phone off, burying it under pillows. It didn't matter. Even when it was powered down, the call came. The screen would flicker awake, glowing with that impossible number, vibrating against the wood as though demanding to be answered. And I always answered. I told myself I wouldn't, but when the time came, I couldn't resist. The idea of ignoring it filled me with more dread than the silence on the other end. It felt like something terrible would happen if I didn't pick up. Something worse than the not silence that waited for me. The air in my apartment began to change. At night, it grew colder. Not the kind of chill that seeps through old windows, but something sharper, concentrated. The kind of cold you feel only in your bones. The smell, too, shifted. Metallic, like rust. Damp, like water left to stagnate in a forgotten place. Sometimes, it reminded me of the scent of soil when it's been freshly dug. I stopped feeling alone. I would lie in bed and hear the faint groan of wood, the subtle drag of something brushing along the floor. Once, I heard a click, as though a door latch had moved, even though every lock was still secure. I kept the lights on, but the glow only seemed to deepen the shadows. Corners darkened, stretching across the walls like stains. Always the call came. Always at 3. The strangest part was that the calls never lasted more than a few minutes, yet when they ended, time seemed wrong. I'd glance at the clock and see that half an hour had vanished, or more. Sometimes I'd blink, and the faint glow of dawn was already beginning to bleed through the blinds. The nights blurred together. The calls didn't stop. I stopped trying to pretend it was a prank or some kind of glitch. I knew deep down that it wasn't. It felt like the calls weren't reaching me from a phone at all, but from somewhere else. Somewhere further away, and yet impossibly close. One night, I tried recording it. I set up my old tape recorder beside the phone, pressed play before answering, and held the receiver to my ear like always. The silence poured through, thick and heavy, until the line clicked dead again. I played the tape back immediately, desperate to hear proof that it wasn't all in my head. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then faintly, so faintly I almost missed it, a voice. Not loud, not clear, but there, a whisper buried beneath the stillness, speaking words I couldn't understand. Not English, not anything I recognized, just low guttural sounds, almost like chanting. My hand shook as I rewound it and played it again. But the second time, there was nothing, just empty silence. The voice was gone. That was the night I realized the calls weren't just meant for me to hear. They were meant to change me. Now, the hour before 3 feels like a countdown. My body knows before the clock does. My chest tightens, my skin prickles, and I lie there waiting, unwilling but unable to stop it. When the phone vibrates against the nightstand, I feel a pressure in the air, as though the entire room is holding its breath. The silence on the line has grown different, heavier. It doesn't just sit in my ear anymore. It presses against me, seeps into me. I swear I can hear it now even after the call ends. The faint hum of something alive and patient, waiting for me to answer again tomorrow. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what waits at the other end. But I know this, the calls are not random. They are not harmless. Something is reaching through that thin veil of silence at 3 a.m., and it has found me. And if you ever wake to the sound of your phone vibrating in the stillness of that hour, don't answer. Because once you do, it never stops. It started with something so small that I almost brushed it off. A flicker on the screen of my old landline phone. I still keep one in my apartment, though everyone insists they're obsolete. I like the weight of it, the way it rings, how it feels rooted in something more physical than the endless scroll of glowing screens. The phone sits on a narrow table against the wall, its cord twisted like veins, the plastic slightly yellowed from time and heat. It never rings, at least not anymore. I hardly give it thought, except when I dust around it. But on that night, when the silence in my apartment pressed in heavy and still, the phone broke the quiet with its shrill sound. I turned toward it slowly, almost as though I already knew something was wrong. The ringer was too loud, too sharp against the quiet air. I glanced at the glowing caller ID screen, expecting nothing but the usual spam or perhaps a wrong number. Instead, I froze. The number displayed was my own. Not my cell, not another line. My exact home phone number, glowing in pale green digits, glaring back at me as though the call was coming from inside my walls. The air around me seemed to thicken. I didn't move at first. I just stood in the dim light of my living room, staring at it. The steady buzz of the ringer filled the room, and I felt a vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet, as if the sound was radiating through the wood itself. My instinct was to pick it up, but my body wouldn't move. My skin prickled, every hair standing upright. A sour smell rose faintly from the phone table, not strong but sharp, like dust that had been heated too long under a bulb, or the faint sting of ozone before a storm. When the ringing finally stopped, the silence it left behind felt heavier than before. I tried to reason with myself. Caller ID glitches happen. Technology fails. Maybe it was some scam using spoofing software. Maybe. But even as I thought it, the explanation felt thin. The room itself didn't feel right anymore. The air was dense, as if it had been used up, stale and damp. I walked closer to the phone, hesitant, my bare feet pressing into the cold wood floor. I reached out, touched the receiver gently. The plastic was warm, too warm, as though it had been sitting under a lamp, though there was nothing nearby to heat it. I lifted the phone. The faint hum of the dial tone greeted me, steady, endless. And beneath it, something else. At first I thought it was the static you sometimes hear, that faint hiss in the background. But no, it was too deliberate, too soft, as though it was shaped into breaths. Breaths that weren't mine. I pressed the receiver harder to my ear, straining. There it was. Slow, uneven inhalations. Long silences between them, followed by the low scrape of something against the mouthpiece. Not a voice, not words, but something alive pressing close. I set the phone down slowly, careful not to make a sound. My chest ached from holding in my own breath. The night went on. I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with only the glow of the streetlight through the blinds, waiting, listening. It came again. The phone rang, sharp, echoing through my apartment. I didn't even need to look, but I did, and there it was again, my number glowing alive. I didn't answer this time. I let it ring, but with each cycle of the sound it seemed to grow louder, closer, until it wasn't coming from the phone at all, but vibrating in the walls, the floor, the air around me. When it stopped, I realized my hands were shaking. I turned the phone over, staring at its underside, as though I would find something hidden there. Wires leading somewhere they shouldn't, a hand pressed against the plastic from the other side. But it was the same. Just a phone. Just a piece of plastic and metal. I unplugged it. I pulled the cord from the wall and left it on the floor like a dead thing. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Hours later, in the thick of the night, I heard the ringer again. Sharp, piercing, impossible. I turned toward it, every muscle rigid. The phone wasn't plugged in. The cord lay limp, separated from the wall, yet the phone sat on the table glowing, ringing, vibrating against the wood. I didn't pick it up. I didn't move. I sat in the dark while it rang, and when it finally went quiet, the stillness felt suffocating, like someone had been waiting for me to respond and was now patiently biding their time. I tried to sleep, but the quiet was alive. Every sound became sharper, stranger. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the ceiling, the distant bark of a dog outside. I could smell something faint drifting through the apartment now, something like damp earth or old water left in a metal pipe. I couldn't place it. The next morning, the phone sat silently where I'd left it, black plastic cold to the touch, the cord still loose on the floor. For a while, I convinced myself it had all been in my head, a nightmare stretched too thin across the dark hours. But when night returned, so did the ringing. Always the same. Always my number, glowing back at me. I started leaving the receiver off the hook, dangling. That didn't stop it. I would hear the sound anyway, not through the phone but deep in the structure of the apartment itself, as though the call was embedded in the walls, rattling through pipes, seeping through the wiring. I tried to sleep in another room, closing the door, shoving the phone into a drawer. It followed me. The sound was always close, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. And then came the moment I had dreaded most. I pressed the receiver to my ear one last time, desperate, hoping to prove to myself it was nothing more than empty noise. But the breaths were back, closer this time, heavier. They didn't echo faintly anymore. They filled the line as though someone was pressed right against the other end. I stayed frozen, my own breathing shallow. And then I heard it. Not words, but the faintest imitation of my own breath. Perfectly timed. Inhalation, exhalation. It was me. Something on the other side was breathing exactly in rhythm with me. I dropped the receiver. It swung on its cord, knocking against the wall. My stomach twisted, and the sour smell filled the room again, stronger now, sharp and metallic. I don't use the phone anymore. I can't. It still rings sometimes, even though I've thrown it into the closet, cordless and broken. I hear it faintly under everything else, a shrill tone buried beneath the ordinary sounds of life. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of night, when I'm lying awake in the dark, I hear breathing that isn't mine. Not in the walls, not in the phone, but close. Too close. As if something on the other end of that impossible call finally found a way across. I still remember the exact weight of the air that day. It was one of those afternoons where silence feels heavy, like the world itself is holding its breath. The curtains in my living room were drawn halfway, letting in slivers of light that cut across the floor in pale, dust-filled beams. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee from the morning, mixed with the faint metallic tang that clung to the old radiator pipes. Everything about that moment was ordinary, unremarkable, until the phone rang. It wasn't unusual for my phone to ring, of course, but there was something different about this one. It was the landline, the old one I almost never used anymore. Its chime wasn't like the tinny melodies of modern cell phones. It had a sharp, echoing bell that cut through the stillness of the house with an almost accusing tone. The sound made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain, as though something was out of place. I stared at the phone as it rang. Each note seemed louder than the last, like it was demanding an answer. My chest felt tight, my pulse quickened, and my hand hovered over it for just a second longer than it should have. Finally, I picked up. What I heard wasn't a voice. No greeting, no words. Just breathing. Not faint, not muffled, not accidental. The sound was deliberate. Slow, deep inhalations followed by long, heavy exhalations. The kind of breathing you hear when someone is close. Too close. It wasn't the quick, accidental breath of a pocket dial. It had rhythm. It had presence. I stood there, frozen, the receiver pressed against my ear. My first instinct was to say something, but the words refused to come out. My throat felt constricted, like it understood something my brain didn't want to process. Instead, I listened. The breathing went on. The hiss of air filling lungs. The almost wet sound of it leaving. Every cycle felt longer, heavier, like whoever was on the other end was savoring each breath. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing in a dark room, holding a phone, waiting. Listening back to me. At first, I thought maybe it was a prank. Some bored stranger dialing random numbers. But the longer I stood there, the more that explanation unraveled. The breaths weren't hurried or playful. They were patient, measured. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. And then, as though the silence between us grew too unbearable, the breathing changed. It got closer. That's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't louder in volume, but there was a shift in quality. The sound carried weight, a texture, like the difference between someone across the room and someone standing right behind you. I could almost feel it against my ear, warm and damp, as though the person was breathing into me, through the phone, through the line itself. I slammed the receiver down. The ringing silence of the house returned immediately. The only sound was my own heart, hammering in my chest. I tried to steady my breathing, but each attempt felt shallow, almost panicked. The phone sat there like nothing had happened, its coiled cord draped over the table, swaying faintly as though mocking me. I told myself it was nothing, a wrong number, a creep, something explainable. But then, as I stepped back, the phone rang again. The sound stabbed through me. I froze. My body screamed at me not to pick it up, but my hand moved almost on its own, as though compelled. Against every ounce of reason, I lifted the receiver to my ear once more. Breathing. Again the same slow, deliberate rhythm. As if the person had never left. As if they'd been waiting for me to return. This time I noticed something else. Between breaths, there was a faint crackle on the line. Not the kind of static you get from a weak signal, but the faintest suggestion of movement. A subtle shuffle, like fabric brushing against something. I strained to hear more, but the longer I listened, the more I realized the breathing wasn't just sound. It was presence. I could feel it, like a pressure pressing against my ear, against my skin. I held my breath, almost hoping that if I didn't make a sound, they wouldn't know I was there. But the moment I did, the breathing shifted, as if responding. Quicker now. Hungrier. I dropped the phone again, stumbling back so hard I knocked over a glass of water from the coffee table. The spill spread quickly across the wood, soaking papers, dripping onto the floor, but I barely noticed. My eyes stayed fixed on the phone, waiting. The silence stretched on. A minute passed. Then two. I started to think maybe it was over. That maybe the line had gone dead. But then 3 rings. And then silence. No more calls. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to every creak of the house, every groan of the wood as it settled. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, as though the darkness itself had thickened. My body was tense, my ears straining for a sound I couldn't name, but knew I would recognize the moment I heard it. At some point, I must have drifted into a restless half-sleep, because when I opened my eyes again, the room was dimly lit by the pale blue glow of the alarm clock. 3:12 a.m. The phone rang. Not my cell. The landline. I froze. My body refused to move, but the sound filled every corner of the house. Each chime vibrated through the walls, echoing down the hallway, drilling into me. I thought about ignoring it, pretending it wasn't happening, but the ringing was relentless. It didn't stop. It didn't slow. After what felt like forever, I got up. My bare feet brushed the cold floorboards as I made my way to the living room. The air felt thicker now, damp almost, and the faint smell of dust and metal was sharper, stronger like rust. The phone sat on the table, its bell screaming into the dark. I reached out with a trembling hand and lifted the receiver, breathing. But this time, I swear I could hear something else beneath it. Not words exactly, but the suggestion of them. A faint murmur, too low to distinguish, like whispers being spoken just below the threshold of hearing. My skin crawled. My mouth went dry. It was like standing in a dark room, where you know someone else is there, but can't see them. I listened longer than I should have. Long enough for the whispers to almost form syllables. Shapes of words that weren't words at all. Every instinct screamed at me to hang up, to run, to do anything but keep listening. But I couldn't. The sound pinned me in place, paralyzed me. And then click. The line went dead. I stood there holding the silent receiver, staring into nothing, my body shaking. When I finally placed it back down, the house felt different. Colder. The air carried a weight that hadn't been there before, as though something had crossed a threshold. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I unplugged the landline. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. No connection, no calls. No breathing. For a while it worked. Days passed, quiet and uneventful. I started to believe it was over. But sometimes, when the house is still, when the silence presses against me in that same heavy way, I swear I can hear it. Not from the phone anymore. From somewhere closer. That slow, deliberate breathing, waiting for me to pick up. I don't think there's a sound in this world more cruel than the ring of a phone in an empty house. It cuts through everything, silence, thought, even grief. It feels intrusive like a blade. That sound came the evening after the funeral. The house was still heavy with the scent of flowers, not the fresh kind, but the wilted ones that had been sitting too long in vases filled with cloudy water. The air was stale from too many people moving in and out the day before, the scent of cologne and cigarette smoke still faintly clinging to the curtains. My clothes still smelled like the church, wood polish, candle wax, and damp stone. Everything was too quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears because your mind hasn't caught up to the stillness. I hadn't turned on the television. I hadn't opened a window. The lamps were dim, their glow soft but colorless, as if even light was too exhausted to linger in that house. Then the phone rang. It was an old landline, the kind my family had kept out of habit more than need. No one really called it anymore. The ringer was sharp, mechanical, like it belonged to another decade. The sound filled the house, bouncing off the walls, demanding attention. I froze. I can't explain why I didn't just pick it up right away. Maybe it was because I knew who couldn't be calling. My body stiffened, my chest tightened, and for a few long seconds, I just listened to it ring. The funeral had been for my father. It wasn't sudden. Illness had been eating away at him for months, leaving him a shadow of who he had been. Still, no amount of preparation dulls the way death silences a person. One day there are voices, laughter, even small arguments, and then suddenly nothing. Just an absence that fills every space. I told myself the call had to be someone from the funeral service. A relative checking in. A mistake. That was all. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver, the plastic cold and smooth against my skin. I lifted it to my ear. What I heard wasn't a voice. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate. Inhale. Exhale. The sound of air moving through lungs that shouldn't have existed anymore. The silence in my house seemed to collapse inward, like everything was leaning closer to the phone. The breathing wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. It was steady, calm, almost patient. I held my breath to make sure it wasn't my own echo. It wasn't. The rhythm didn't match me. It went on, unbroken, as though whoever it was on the other end was waiting for me to speak. I didn't. I couldn't. My throat locked up, my tongue heavy. Minutes passed. At least it felt like minutes. The breathing never faltered, never cracked into a word, never shifted into a cough or sigh. It was just there, constant, like someone standing too close in the dark. And then suddenly it stopped. The line went dead. No click. No goodbye. Just silence. I set the receiver back into its cradle with hands that didn't feel like mine. The weight of it made a hollow thud, and then the house was silent again, the ringing gone, leaving behind something much heavier. I told myself it was nothing, a wrong number, a prank, some glitch in the line. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had heard that breathing before. It was the same sound I used to hear when I sat in the hospital at night, when my father would fall asleep with the oxygen mask shifting against his face. That heavy, fragile rhythm of a body fighting to keep going. I had listened to it for weeks, the way other people listen to music. That memory had been carved into me. I knew it was his. I couldn't sleep that night. The house creaked too much, the air too still. I kept glancing at the phone, its coiled cord twisted like a snake. Part of me was terrified it would ring again, but another part of me waited for it. Needed it. It did. At 2:13 a.m., the sharp ring cut through the dark. I jolted upright, my chest pounding, sweat dampening the sheets. The house seemed to groan with the sound, every wall amplifying it. I answered. The breathing returned. This time, it was softer, fainter, like the sound was coming from further away. But it was there. The inhale, the exhale. My hand shook so badly the receiver tapped against my ear. I wanted to speak, to say something, to ask who it was, even though I already knew. But every word died before it left my lips. My tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, useless. The breathing continued for longer this time, almost 10 minutes. I sat there listening, my whole body stiff, my eyes wide in the dark. My father was gone, buried 6 feet beneath damp earth. And yet, here he was, filling the line with the sound of lungs that should no longer move. When the call ended, the silence was worse than before. It became a routine. The phone would ring once every night, always after midnight, always the same sound. Breathing. Never words. Never anything else. just breathing. I stopped leaving the house. I sat in the living room in the dark, waiting. The air began to smell like dust and stagnant water because I wasn't opening windows anymore. My world shrank to the couch, the phone, and that sound. Each call stretched longer than the last. Sometimes 20 minutes. Sometimes more. The breathing grew louder, closer, as if the distance between us was shrinking. I began to notice small details, the way the inhale whistled slightly, the faint rasp at the back of the throat, the soft wetness of mucus shifting in the lungs. Every detail was his. Then something changed. On the seventh night, after nearly half an hour of listening, the breathing paused. For a moment, I thought the line had died. But then, faintly, I heard something else. A sound I remembered too well. The rattle. The death rattle. That gurgling, fragile noise a body makes when it is too weak to clear its own throat. I had been there the first time I heard it, in that hospital room, watching my father fade. Hearing it again through the phone made my stomach twist. And then I heard something I hadn't expected. A whisper. Not words, not anything I could understand. Just the faint vibration of air forced through lips that no longer had the strength to shape sound. A broken attempt at speech. It continued for nearly an hour before fading back into silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The calls went on for weeks, each one lasting longer, each one heavier. The breathing shifted into whispers more and more often, faint, fragmented, like someone trapped behind layers of static. I pressed the receiver hard against my ear, desperate to catch something, anything that made sense. One night, I thought I heard my name, but it was so weak, so fragmented, I couldn't be sure. The air in the house grew worse. Stale, sour, like a closed room where someone had been sick too long. Sometimes I swore I could smell the faint metallic tang of blood, the bitter chemical bite of hospital disinfectant. I realized I was starting to recognize those scents. They were the smells of the hospice, the same ones I thought I'd left behind. Somehow they had followed me home. The last call came on the 42nd night. It began like all the others. The phone rang at 3:07 a.m., sharp and mechanical, pulling me from a restless half-sleep. I answered with hands that no longer shook. I was used to it now. The breathing was there, but it was louder than it had ever been. Too close. So close it didn't sound like it was coming from the phone at all. It sounded like it was in the room with me. I sat frozen, my skin prickling, my chest tightening. The whispers started again, faint and broken, but more insistent. I leaned forward, pressing the receiver against my ear until it hurt. That's when I heard it. The whisper shaped itself into something clear. Open the door. The line went dead, and before the silence could settle, I heard it again. Not through the phone this time, through the front door. A soft, heavy breath. Waiting. It started with the ring. Not a cheerful chime, not a friendly tone, but that old, flat, mechanical sound that doesn't belong to the present anymore. A sound that should have been left in the 70s, heavy and metallic, like something vibrating through pipes instead of wires. The first time I heard it, I brushed it off. Wrong number. A glitch. A prank. Except it never stopped. Always the same way. Always at night. Always when the house was quiet enough for the faintest hum of the refrigerator to feel like thunder in the stillness. I moved houses. I thought I could leave it behind. Thought I could bury that sound inside the walls of the place I abandoned. I convinced myself it belonged to the location, maybe even to the line itself. But it didn't. It came with me. The first night in the new place, boxes stacked like broken towers around me. The floor still covered in the fine grit of plaster dust. I heard it again. The phone was still in its box, not even plugged in, but the ringing crept through the air like a memory. Low, steady, vibrating against the stillness. I froze, hand halfway to opening another carton, the cardboard whispering against my skin. The house smelled of old paint, of damp wood that hadn't been touched in years, and beneath it all, something metallic, almost coppery, like old pennies held too long in the palm. It rang 3 times. Then silence. I told myself exhaustion was playing tricks. Moving does that to you, blurring edges, bending sounds, making shadows seem thicker than they really are. I didn't sleep that night, though. I lay on the mattress on the floor, eyes to the ceiling, tracing the cracks like veins. waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't. Not then. Days passed. I convinced myself it was fine. But at night, when the air cooled and the house groaned with the stretch of settling wood, I heard it again. The phone that shouldn't ring. The call that didn't exist. Sometimes it came from the kitchen, faint and muffled, like the sound was trapped inside the cupboards. Sometimes from the hallway, where the wallpaper curled away in strips. Once, I swear it came from right behind me, so close that the hairs on the back of my neck lifted, as if the sound had been breathed into my ear instead of heard with it. Always the same, 3 rings. Then silence. I tried to track it. I unplugged every device. My cell phone lay dark on the table. The landline wasn't connected. The walls were bare. Yet the sound persisted, sneaking through the cracks in the house, rattling inside the silence like a presence. I began to notice other things. Small things at first, the kind you'd ignore until they piled too high to step over. The smell. Not constant, but sudden waves of it. That metallic tang again, sharp and unpleasant, as if the air carried the scent of something burnt and old, something that lingered in fabric long after it had been destroyed. And then the air itself, heavy in places, as though the rooms weren't quite empty. I'd walk from one to another and feel the shift, the weight pressing on me like humidity without warmth. Some nights I'd find myself standing in the doorway to the living room, staring into the dark, heart beating slow and deliberate, because I swore someone was already there, waiting in the dark. But always, it came back to the call. The last house I lived in, the calls had started with the landline. It would ring in the dead of night, and when I picked up, there would be nothing but silence. Not even static, just the sound of the line being open, wide and hollow, as if it stretched into a void without end. I'd hold it there, the plastic warm against my face, ear pressed tight, hoping for a voice, fearing one. All I ever got was that silence. And sometimes, worse than any words, the faint impression of breathing. That's what made me leave. That's why I moved. I thought I could leave the sound behind, bury it in a different neighborhood, drown it under a new roof. But it followed me. One night, weeks after moving in, the call came louder. No device. No phone. Just the sound ripping through the silence, vibrating the air itself. I sat up in bed, covers bunched around my waist, and waited. My chest ached with the weight of each breath. My skin felt tight, prickling with that electric tension that fills the body right before lightning strikes. 3 rings. Then quiet. But this time, the quiet wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, humming with something alive. I sat there, frozen, staring into the dark corners of my new room, the corners where the shadows seemed to crawl against the ceiling like spilled ink. And I realized something. The call wasn't just ringing through the house. It was ringing through me. The sound wasn't heard, it was felt, deep in the chest, like a second heartbeat. The silence after was worse, because in that silence, I thought I heard the faintest shift of breath. Not my own, not in rhythm with mine. Something slower, deeper, dragging air in and out with the patience of something that had no reason to rush. That's when I knew it wasn't the house. It wasn't the line. It was me. Wherever I go, the call will follow. I don't know if it wants me to answer, or if it already knows that I have. Maybe every time I hear that silence, every time I feel that breath, I'm not just listening. Maybe I'm being listened to. The smell comes more often now. Stronger, sharper. Sometimes I wake up to it choking the room, that metallic tang of old blood baked into the air. The ringing is more frequent too, echoing through walls, rising from the floorboards, vibrating the window glass. I don't think it's going to stop. Sometimes I catch myself waiting for it. Sitting in the dark, staring at the phone that isn't plugged in, watching its dead screen, waiting for a sound that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, just before it comes, I feel a shift in the room, a change in the air pressure, a flicker in the corner of vision, a darkness just slightly darker than the rest. And then it rings. 3 times. Always 3. Followed by silence. A silence that is no longer empty. A silence that feels closer every time, pressing against my ear, against my skin, against the inside of my head. I don't know how long I can keep pretending I haven't answered. Because the truth is, I already did. And whatever called me is still on the line. It began with something so simple, so ordinary, that I almost didn't pay attention to it. A phone ringing. Nothing more. I was used to calls at odd hours, scammers, wrong numbers, robocalls. I usually ignored them, let them drown in silence until the vibration stopped. But this one was different. The number itself wasn't right. I still remember the glow of my phone's screen in the dark. The digits didn't make sense. Not a normal 10-digit number, not even an international one. It was longer, stretched out like something written by a hand that didn't know where to stop. Symbols mixed in with numbers. Dashes that weren't dashes. A string that looked more like static than an actual sequence. My phone shouldn't have even been able to display it. And yet, there it was, glowing against the blackness of my bedroom. A number that shouldn't exist. The first time, I didn't answer. I watched it until the vibration died and the screen went dark, leaving me in the heavy silence of my room. I tried to dismiss it, but a strange unease settled over me, like the lingering smell of smoke after you've blown out a candle. It called again the next night. Same impossible number, same faint vibration rattling against my nightstand. My eyes burned from staring at the screen too long, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't random, at least it didn't feel random. The string of numbers and symbols seemed almost intentional, as if there was some hidden pattern. I ignored it again, but the silence that followed was worse. My room, usually comforting in its stillness, began to feel foreign. The air was thicker. Shadows stretched too far in the corners. I swore I heard faint sounds, not loud enough to be clear, something like faint tapping beneath the floorboards, or fingers grazing the walls. The third night, I couldn't resist. I let it ring until my chest ached with the pressure of dread. Then I reached out with a hand that felt colder than the rest of my body. The phone trembled slightly in my palm, though it wasn't vibrating anymore. My thumb hovered over the answer button. When I finally pressed it, nothing happened. No voice, no sound, not even the faint hum of a line connecting. Just silence. A silence so complete it felt alive. I tried to speak, but the words died in my throat. It wasn't like talking into a dead line. It was like something on the other end was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I hung up. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every shift of the air, every faint hum of appliances became unbearable. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, pounding uneven. It felt like I had opened something that should have remained closed. The next day, I checked the call log. The number wasn't there. The entry simply didn't exist, as though it had never happened. I told myself it was a glitch. Phones malfunction all the time. Software corrupts. Ghost numbers, people called them. But a part of me knew better. Because it called again. This time, not at night, but in broad daylight, when the sun was spilling through the blinds and my house smelled faintly of coffee and dust. The screen lit up again with that impossible number. Something about seeing it in the daylight made it worse, not better. Like it had followed me, refusing to be confined to the dark. Again I answered. Again silence. But not quite silence. If I held the phone just right, pressed tight against my ear, I could hear it. Breathing. Long, slow, uneven. Not mechanical. Not human either. Something in between, like an imitation of breathing rather than breathing itself. It followed me everywhere. In the kitchen it would ring. In the shower, I would hear the faint vibration from the counter. While driving, the phone would light up in the passenger seat with the same impossible sequence. Sometimes, when I ignored it, the calls would come faster, more insistent, until my phone buzzed like a trapped insect, almost constant. When I answered, it would calm. The breathing would return. I started to dread the quiet after hanging up more than the sound itself. When the call ended, the world never felt right. Colors seemed drained. Objects in my house felt subtly wrong, shifted just slightly from where they had been. One night, after weeks of this, I made the mistake of listening longer than I should have. I lay in bed, phone pressed to my ear, letting the breathing seep into my head. Minutes passed. My body felt heavy, sinking into the mattress. And then I heard it. A sound behind the breathing. Scraping. Faint, almost inaudible, like nails dragging against a wooden surface. Then a thud, irregular, heavy. Something moving. The longer I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't just random noise. It was footsteps. Uneven. Slow. Coming closer. I ripped the phone away from my ear, heart hammering so violently I thought it would tear itself apart. But the call was still active. I hadn't ended it. The sound continued. For the first time, I felt sure. What I was hearing wasn't happening far away. It wasn't on the other side of some abstract connection. It was near me, in my space. The breathing on the line synced with the coldness in my room, as if the air itself had changed. When I finally found the strength to hang up, the silence that followed was unbearable. My room didn't feel like my room anymore. Every shadow pressed closer, every corner felt inhabited. That was when I noticed it. On my nightstand, beside the phone, lay something that hadn't been there before. A small object, no bigger than a coin. A piece of plastic, warped and cracked, with faint numbers etched into it. Numbers that matched the impossible sequence on my phone screen. I didn't touch it. I didn't sleep. The calls kept coming, more frequent, more insistent, until they bled into every part of my life. Work, errands, even moments when I wasn't near the phone. I would hear the vibration in my head, feel it in my bones. I tried turning the phone off. It didn't matter. The screen would still glow in the dark, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, the impossible number burning against the black. I tried getting rid of the phone, threw it into a dumpster miles away. That night, as I lay in bed, the vibration returned. I reached out against every ounce of reason, and there it was, my phone, back on the nightstand, glowing with that same string of impossible digits. By then, I knew it wasn't just about the calls. It wasn't about the number. It was about me. Whatever it was, it had latched on. I don't answer anymore. Not because I'm stronger, but because I know it doesn't matter. Answering only makes it closer. Ignoring it only makes the silence worse. The number still calls. Every night. Every day. Sometimes once. Sometimes 100 times. My phone vibrates even when the battery is dead, even when it shouldn't work. I don't know what it wants. But I know this. If you ever see that number, if your screen ever lights up with something that shouldn't exist, don't answer. Don't listen. Don't let it inside. Because once you do, it doesn't leave. And silence is never empty again.